So now we turn our attention to the final linkage group, interest groups, which play a very significant role in American society. Interest groups, which were originally called factions by the Founding Fathers, have existed for all of our history. Interest groups serve to represent people that have very specific economic, social, ideological, agricultural, or business interests in our society. And they use different methods to try to present the interests of the people in their group to the government to adopt policies that favor those groups of people. So in this final chapter of the course, we are going to study the role of interest groups in our political system because they do play a very large role, and it's very important to understand how they are involved in the policymaking process. Now at the top, you can see in this picture members of the NAACP planning a voter targeting campaign during the 1960 presidential election. On the bottom of the slide, you can see television host Stephen Colbert and members of Colbert Nation celebrating the creation of their own super PAC for the 2012 election cycle. So, in this chapter, we will begin our study of interest groups by tracing their origins and development historically, looking at the roots of the American interest group system and describing its historical development. Then, we will identify the political strategies and tactics that are used by interest groups and look at the factors that make those interest groups successful. Then finally, we will look at efforts to reform interest groups and rein in their political power, because there are people that think maybe they exercise too much power in our political system. So let's begin with the first objective by looking at the roots of the American interest group system and where they began. As we've said, interest groups are organized collections of people or organizations that try to influence public policy. They are different from political parties because they do not run candidates for political office. Political parties organize people, but they nominate and run candidates for political office. Interest groups do not do that. They do not put their label on a candidate. They don't run candidates for office, though they may certainly support or oppose specific candidates. Interest groups go by many names, such as special interest groups, pressure groups, organized interests, non-governmental organizations, political groups, lobbying groups, or public interest groups. They go by many different names, but they are still all interest groups, interested in advancing the interests of their group of people. In this section, we will talk about the different theories of interest group formation and the different kinds of groups that exist in our political system. There is no shortage of theories to explain how interest groups form and how they influence public policy. For example, the pluralist theory, which was introduced at the beginning of the course, argues that political power is divided among a wide range of competing interest groups. Taking one step further, this becomes what is called disturbance theory, which claims that interest groups form in response to changes in the political system. In turn, groups that are opposed to the first group's interests will form as well, thus ensuring that a wide range of voices are active in the political system. Ironically, this is evident in the establishment of transactions theory, which arose out of criticism of the pluralist theory and disturbance theory approaches. But you should be familiar with all of these theories of interest group formation, and you should understand how they operate within the political system and why different political scientists give credibility to these different theories of interest groups. Interest groups can take many forms, as we've already said. Public interest groups, for example, seek a collective good for a larger group of people. Both the civil rights movement and the progressive era's push for better working and living conditions for immigrants fall under this category. Economic interest groups, on the other hand, exist to promote the economic interests of their members. These include trade and professional organizations, such as the American Medical Association, or AMA, and labor groups, such as the AFL-CIO. Next, we have governmental units. Yes, government lobbies government. In the increasingly complex world of federal policy and bureaucracy, state and local governments have found themselves needing to lobby for their interests as well. Finally, we have political action committees, or PACs, which are officially registered fundraising organizations that represent interest groups in the political process. So what are characteristics of selected interest groups? Well, here you see a chart with examples of certain selected interest groups in front of you. The name of the group when it was founded, how many people belong to it, if it has a political action committee or not, and how much money it raised through its political action committee in the 2014 midterm election cycle. So let's take a quick look at this table, which shows us the membership levels and fundraising characteristics of some of the major interest groups. As you can see, the AARP tops the membership list with 40 million members, followed by the AFL-CIO, which we mentioned in the last slide, with 11.5 million members, and then MoveOn.org, which has 5 million members. Of those three, only AARP does not also have a political action committee. Most interest groups tend to have political action committees because it's through their ability to raise money and then to spend that money to give to candidates running for office or to support or oppose candidates running for office in which they find some of their greatest influence in the political process. The framers of the Constitution, as we'll see in this next objective, wanted to minimize the influence of any single interest group on the new American government. This explains in part why they were so careful to create a system with the extensive checks and balances that our Constitution has. Yet, as careful as they were, there was no way they could have foreseen the vast sums of money that would ultimately, in this day and age, come to define the interest group involvement in American politics and policy. In this section, we will trace the historical development of the modern interest group. So when and how did interest groups emerge? All kinds of local interest groups existed in America since the days of the colonies and early states. But it was not until the 1830s, during the age of Andrew Jackson, when communication networks improved, that national groups began to form. Often, these groups formed around a single issue. For example, the American Anti-Slavery Society, founded by William Lloyd Garrison, was one of the first national groups. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, which sought prohibition, is another example of an early national group. Following the Civil War, the Grange formed to help teach farmers about the latest agricultural developments and seek legislation to help them. Business interests grew active during this time as well. People used to joke that the Standard Oil Company did everything to the Pennsylvania legislature except refine it. And in 1861, the Central Pacific Railroad sent its own lobbyists to Washington, D.C. In turn, it received vast land grants and subsidized loans from the government. One of the first truly national groups was the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, or more simply, the Grange, established in 1867 to educate and disseminate knowledge to farmers. The group also lobbied for farmers' interests in other areas, such as trust busting. As you probably recall from earlier history courses you've taken, particularly that in U.S. history, the progressive movement rose in response to rapid industrialization and the poor working and living conditions that followed. Progressive-era interest groups called for everything from public libraries to unions to an end to racial discrimination. Out of this was born the organized labor movement. The American Federation of Labor, or AFL, was the first national labor union of skilled workers, and it had to push back hard when business interests sought to outlaw unions. Ultimately, the AFL was able to get the Clayton Act passed in 1914. This allowed unions to organize and even to strike. In response to the growing strength of unions, the trade association, National Association of Manufacturers, was formed in 1895. It became very active politically in 1913. In fact, it was so forceful politically that President Woodrow Wilson called its tactics an unbearable situation. Around this same time, the Chamber of Commerce was created in 1912. During the 1960s and the 1970s, the spirit of the progressive era was as strong as ever. Public interest group membership and activity soared as interest groups fought for the rights and welfare of African Americans, women, the elderly, the poor, and consumers. In response to the success of these efforts, conservatives launched their own interest groups. The Reverend Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority in 1978. The Moral Majority played an important role in electing Ronald Reagan president in 1980. 10 years later, televangelist Pat Roberts formed the Christian Coalition, whose influence was crucial to the Republican takeover of Congress in 1994. But religious groups aren't the only conservative organizations with power. The National Rifle Association has raised and spent a great deal of money to defeat gun control laws. Business and labor groups have also risen in power. We have the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, as well as the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Historically, most union members were white, male, blue-collar workers, and female teachers. In more recent years, however, unions have become more female and more diverse. Part of this change is the result of broadening union membership to include service workers, such as those shown here protesting with the Service Employees Industrial Union. As we've seen with some of the interest groups we've already discussed, many don't start out political. So what do interest groups do? That's our third objective. Well, even though they don't start out political, they may quickly become political if they decide legislation is the answer to their problem. Individuals may band together in an interest group to increase the volume of their voices in Washington, which in turn may lead to favorable legislation. This doesn't come for free, however. Changes in law can increase the scope and cost of government, which affects taxpayers. In this section, we will review the pros and the cons of interest group activity in our political system. One of the primary tactics that is used by many interest groups is lobbying. It's easy to see from this section what the top priority is for most interest groups. Just to be clear, lobbying is defined as the activities of a group or organization that seeks to persuade political leaders to support the group's position. The term lobbying likely has its roots in the legislative lobbies where interest group members had to wait to speak to lawmakers during the 19th century. Almost all interest groups lobby by testifying at congressional hearings and contacting legislators. They may provide information to lawmakers and encourage their members to rally around the cause. Interest groups lobby by testifying, sending letters or emails, and of course, giving campaign contributions. Lobbyists tend to work most closely with representatives who share their interests, and their effectiveness depends largely on their reputation for being fair and accurate. Interest groups also lobby the executive branch, which has become more involved in recent years with shaping legislation, and also lobbying the courts. Interest groups lobby the courts by filing lawsuits or friend of the court briefs, also called amicus curiae briefs. And those are briefs that they file in cases they are interested in. A lot of groups have been pretty successful with this type of lobbying. Finally, we have grassroots lobbying, in which group members turn up the heat in some way on lawmakers, and radical activism. Radical activism uses highly visible tactics to change policy. Anti-war and animal activist groups are especially good at this, but the most famous example of this type of protest came early in our history with the Boston Tea Party. So how many lobbyists are there, and how much money do they spend on their lobbying activities? Each year, more than 10,000 lobbyists attempt to influence public policy in Congress and the federal agencies. This large-scale lobbying effort is an expensive industry, costing billions of dollars each year. So what role do lobbyists play in Congress? Well, this cartoon presents one popular view of how legislation gets enacted on Capitol Hill. Political science research, however, reveals that interest groups do not directly buy members' votes in a quid pro quo. They do, however, reward loyal supporters in Congress with campaign contributions and other incentives, which is one reason why they spend so much money to help get supportive members elected. Another activity that interest groups use to accomplish their goals beyond lobbying are election activities. As you've already seen in the most recent election cycle, interest groups don't just try to influence what legislation gets passed. They try to influence who passes the legislation by becoming involved in the electoral process. Some groups recruit, endorse, and may even provide financial assistance to political candidates they want to see in office. One example of such a group is Emily's List. Emily stands for Early Money is Like Yeast, meaning that they support female candidates for office, and by giving them money early on, it's like yeast in a bread that helps that candidate rise and win the election. The Emily's List was founded to support pro-choice Democratic female candidates. The next step is, of course, getting those candidates elected. Many interest groups have impressive get-out-the-vote programs. They identify voters who are likely to support the group's position and actually drive them to the polls. Groups that don't have the resources to drive voters publish guides that rate candidates based on how closely they align to the group's positions and goals. But money talks in politics, and interest groups can raise and distribute money to candidates in several ways. Their members can give directly to candidates, or the organization can create a political action committee to coordinate giving to candidates. Recently, we have also seen the rise of so-called super PACs, which raise money in support or opposition to a candidate or cause, but may not coordinate directly with campaigns and may spend almost an unlimited amount of money. So how much money do interest groups spend on election activity? Political action committees play an important role in national elections. The amount of money they spend, as you can see here, and how it is allocated between Democrats and Republicans varies widely over interest group sectors. Spend a couple of minutes and pause the video and study this chart to see which industries and interests tend to spend the most money on election campaigns to gain influence over our government once the election is over. Now we turn to our fourth objective. What makes interest groups successful? Why are some interest groups very successful in accomplishing their goals and other groups are less successful? Well, as we've said, all interest groups want to influence public policy, though they may go about it differently. But what makes them successful in their goals? Interest groups succeed when they win legislation or court cases, or when they get the person they want elected or defeat the person they don't like. In this section, we will look at several elements that seem to contribute towards or detract from an interest group's success. It's not hard to understand that the success of a group depends on the talents and skills of its leader. Leaders lend personality and direction to a group, especially as it is starting out. In history, several key groups have had very charismatic leaders, from William Lloyd Garrison's efforts with the American Anti-Slavery Society to Frances Willard in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Marion Wright Edelman's leadership of the Children's Defense Fund was crucial to its success, as were Pat Robertson's actions on behalf of the Christian Coalition. As president of the Children's Defense Fund, Marion Wright Edelman continues to fight against child poverty and for better health care. Since the group's establishment in 1973, Edelman has been an active public face for the cause she represents. Influencing public policy, however, is not cheap. To help cover costs, interest groups must rely on a variety of ways to raise money, from membership dues to direct mail and email solicitations for money. As you've probably read about in the news, they may also rely on special events to raise money and on the generous donations of wealthy patrons. As you can imagine, not all members of interest groups participate equally. At the top are the leaders who plan and direct the activities of the organization. Next are the workers of the organization. They attend meetings, pay dues, and chair committees to make sure things get done. Finally, there is the last level of membership, the rank and file members who may pay dues but do little more. So-called free riders may benefit from a group's activities without joining at all. The bigger the group, the greater the chances of free riders. To encourage people to formally join an organization, some groups will offer additional tangible benefits only to members. For example, the AAA offers roadside assistance to members, while AARP offers discounts on meals and other goods and services. AARP has been particularly successful at motivating its pool of potential members to join, in large part because it offers a variety of material benefits. Here, AARP members in Michigan hold a rally advocating the importation of cheaper prescription drugs from Canada, just across the bridge shown in the background. So now we turn to our last objective, the potential reform of interest groups and their activities. Given the force and influence of lobbyists, it's a little hard to grasp the fact that it took 150 years for us to begin regulating their activities. While the courts remain largely free of lobbying regulations, lobbying in Congress and the executive branch is regulated. In this final section, we will examine some of these regulatory efforts. It took a while, but in 1946, Congress began regulating the activities of the people who are paid to lobby. In 1946, Congress passed the Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act, which required some registration of lobbyists. By 1995, however, public opinion polls showed that Americans believed the votes of members of Congress were for sale. In response, Congress passed the Lobbying Disclosure Act in 1995. This one was tougher. There was a stricter definition of lobbying and stricter regulation requirements. Lobbyists had to report their clients and issues and estimate how much they were getting paid. But that didn't stop all the abuses of the system. After lobbyist Jack Abramoff pleaded guilty to corruption charges in 2006, Congress passed the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act of 2007. This act banned gifts and public speaking fees and put longer waiting periods in place before a person could move from a job with the federal government to a lobbying position in the private sector. It's no surprise that formal lobbying of the executive branch is largely covered by the Lobbying Disclosure Act, the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act, and the 1978 Ethics in Government Act. This last act was passed following the Watergate scandal of the Nixon administration, and it barred anyone from an executive branch agency from representing a client in front of their former employer for a minimum of 2 years. As for the judicial branch, its lobbying activities have few formal regulations. Parties must ask permission to file amicus curiae briefs, but this is usually granted. Some people have called for restrictions on so-called legal education seminars, which judges attend at fancy resort hotels and which are paid for by lobbyists. So far, however, these regulations have not passed. So as you can see, interest groups play a large and increasingly large role in making of public policy and politics in our political system. So as we come to the end of this chapter on interest groups, here are some questions that you should be able to give some deep and detailed answers to. Why and how did interest groups develop in the United States? What role do interest groups play in our political system? And why have attempts been made to rein in the political power of interest groups? This brings to an end our look at interest groups.